Hey everybody, welcome back. This is the next episode of Authors Bantering. I'm Josh Breslin. That's Ian M. Rogers. This week we're going to go over researching and how to do it. Obviously, the importance of it is pretty well stated. I was someone, admittedly, at the beginning of my writing career that did not do any research at all. That was probably one of the weakest areas of it. And what I discovered was simply that a lack of research makes your writing weak. The more you know about your subject, the more detailed you can be about it. And the more specific you can be about it, the stronger your writing is going to be. But admittedly, for myself, I don't know about you, Ian, but like a lot of this research is stuff that I already know because I write about subjects that I'm familiar with. It's not often that I get into a territory that I don't know something, just because I keep my scope pretty limited. But I don't know about you.
No, that's a good point actually. Like I think that again, I'm the same way. Like I will steer very close to subjects I know well. So I'm not going out and researching a topic that I know nothing about. Like for example, like how to build a laser or like, how to jet ski because I don't know anything about either of those things. But
Right.
within subjects that I do know well, I find that, sometimes questions will come up maybe organically through the writing like wait a minute, I realize maybe I don't know as much about this thing that I thought that I did, or maybe I need to check a date or something like that, maybe find some smaller information that I knew and then forgotten. So research like that for me can often be about checking these very small kind of details.
Nice. Yeah, and it's one of those things where it can become a really bad form of procrastination if you let it go unchecked. Like
Yes.
there are
Yes.
authors I know who like would take like 6 months basically to do no writing and just to research their subject, and they come back and they know a ton, but like that's 6 months that you've wasted right there. And
I will say
yeah.
actually, I have been guilty of that as well.
Well,
I have, taken time off for, I won't even say research. I'm going to use finger quotes research. Like I told myself that I was going to research, but to me it was just pure procrastination because I was really doing like really very little research at that time and certainly no writing for this more ambitious project that I was planning. But again, I think that the in the example you gave, where the writer is procrastinating, but they're doing research, but they're still getting something out of it. So I think the a person who is in that position might ask themselves, okay, how much am I really getting out of this? If the answer is very little, you probably should be changing up your game.
bingo. And I think for like most research, right? Like just the general things you look for, like a Google search obviously is what you need, right? Like like what's a distance between these 2 points, like there are
Yeah.
a lot of facts you can basically just kind of generate on your own. I think just through a Google search. I'm not sure if you have a much more in-depth research project than that. If it is, it's far more in-depth than mine.
Well, no, so I think that's, I mean, I'm going to make up some numbers. So I will say like 60% of the things that I need to check, maybe even like 80%, but some very large percentage is things that are very easily Googleable or Wikipediaable, where I
Yep.
can just find them very quickly and then substitute them into the manuscript. The remaining 20%, I occasionally will need to, I've gone and checked out books from the library before,
Oh well.
for like for MFA Thesis Novel, I needed to like check something in a copy of a book that I did not have. And so I had to like track the book down in order to check it, things like that, or like the book wasn't available online. Or, for cases where I needed to know more about a topic that maybe was a little bit less inside my wheelhouse. And so that's when I needed to do deeper dives about more esoteric kind of subjects. And again, this wasn't like weeks and weeks of work, but it would be maybe like 2 hours of reading or
Yep.
something like that to maybe sort of get the fleshing out that I needed to maybe make something feel more real or to get details right.
Yeah. And I think like for myself, the most in-depth research I ever need to do is always on police procedure. I don't know like about you, but like that's an area that
I
always
think it's a
hits me.
I think it's a very good thing because again,
Yeah.
if authors get police procedure wrong, there's like
There's a whole like
cops
horde ready
and
to
then
kill
people
you.
who know police procedure who are not cops who are it's gonna feel very wrong to them. So I think
Yes.
that's really smart actually to focus on that.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and that's one of those things where it's like I don't like I have like police friends, so I'll usually just send them a text, be like, "Hey, how do you do
Right.
this?" or "Can I give you a quick call?" and I'll go through it
Thanks.
basically. But yeah, that's an area where you might need to be like an expert, basically, or have someone that's an expert to
Yeah.
help you out because, like, police law things like that, basically, they're so structured and they're so like done matter of factly, basically, that it's one of those things where you do need to kind of know your stuff. You can't really make up too much in that sense.
Yeah, I like that example a lot because one, I think the expert is going to know better than, all the Googling or website reading or book reading that you can possibly do. But then two, you're also going to find that information a little bit faster
Yep.
if you just like text your friend who knows about that kind of thing. And then three, I think that's a really interesting way to build a little community, like little rapport, like, hey, the person knows that I'm a writer, I'm friends with them already, and I feel comfortable asking them this question,
Yep.
and then they feel like they're maybe involved in the book in some way. It's like, oh, I helped out Josh, and then I'm some of my information is going to make it into his novel or something. And I think there's always a place in the acknowledgments for people like that who can help out with that kind of information.
Absolutely. And I think there's another type of research too, like that plays into it, which is like I'll just use the term subjective experiences, where you have a
Mm-hmm.
character going through something and you need to come up with some action that relates that's reasonable for the character, but you need to know their environment first. A big thing I see all the time, and that's what something like Reddit's really good for that, right? Like I see this all the time in books that try to maybe describe things like drug experiences a lot, where I can tell like either an author knows what they're talking about or they don't, just by what the character's doing, what they're experiencing. And it's one of those things where it's like if you haven't obviously like done if you haven't, used heroin before, right? There's a Reddit forum for that. You can look it up and actually see, what the experience is like, what the highs like, what the feeling of the addiction is like, etc. And it's again one of those things where it's a subjective thing. Like your character goes through it, and their experience may not be exactly like somebody else's,
Yes.
but you have to get it at least somewhat close to what someone else has already experienced before. It's you have to get within kind of the ballpark. There's always leeway because everyone's different. Everyone's gonna react differently to certain things, but so much of the subjective stuff that you write, you need to have at least a good consensus amongst others that go through a similar experience to be able to share that. And
I
again,
think
the
I think that's a
drugs
really
is
good.
one example, just because that's an obvious one you see a lot in books. But yeah,
No, I think that's maybe in some ways the perfect example because there are some experiences that I think are often captured very poorly on the page by people who have not had them.
mm-hmm.
And I think drugs are certainly one that I have seen where especially younger writers or writers who certainly never use drugs themselves or maybe have certain beliefs about drugs and certain different kinds of drugs, maybe those beliefs or prejudices will make their way into their writing. Um, and come out very flat. But drugs, I think, are a good example of that. Writing about people of different socioeconomic classes is
Yep.
something that I see a lot. Writing about someone who is of a higher socioeconomic class than you or a lower socioeconomic class, if you have not done the research properly to make that feel real, that can often come across as very flat
Yeah.
in these cases. We've talked about on this before, but then also writing about people with different lived experiences than you, unless you've really done your research on that, those can often come across as very flat as well. And then another one that springs to mind is kind of writing about different places or countries or cultures in a way that if you haven't actually been there or really know what it's like to be there, one, you might get certain things wrong and it'll feel false. But then two, you might just not put in details that you would otherwise put in
Yep.
had you done that research. So maybe if you're writing about, I don't know, San Francisco or Toronto or maybe someplace more exotic or different, it's like, oh, I'm writing about Bulgaria or something. If you haven't done the research, then you might not have enough details to make that really feel like Bulgaria, Toronto, San Francisco. Like it just won't, it'll feel very
Mm.
generic in that case.
And I was going to ask you too. So you've actually written a novel set completely in Japan. You obviously are an American. You were born in America, and all that stuff. So when you wrote the Japan novel, you were living in Japan, and I was going to ask you,
Yeah, yeah.
do you think you could have ever written that if you hadn't lived there? Like, could you have written the Japanese novel if you had not actually gone there and lived it, versus just doing the research online?
That novel, 100% no. And the reason I say 100% no is because the core of that novel was about um, relationships, cultural differences, and issues that I actually faced as a result of living in Japan. And I think that because those issues were at the core of the novel, there is no possible way I could have written about it just by, talking to people and reading books and just hearing about it. I really had to go through that myself again because it was the core of the novel in that sense. I think in other cases, like again, like the hypothetical travel examples I was talking about with, Toronto or San Francisco, if, Toronto culture is not the core of your novel, and you just have a scene that's set in Toronto or a couple of pages set in Toronto or something like that, I think the bar for lived experience or actual experience in that place is much, much lower.
Oh
I think
wow.
it's less integral to the story. I think you can go a lot farther with research when you have, again, something that's more minor like that, as opposed to something that is the core of the story. Does that difference make sense? Like that kind of distinction?
Yeah, no, it does, and and that's kind of what I wanted to get to was that like certain stories, the requirement for research is going to be different. Like there are some that if you want to get really in depth with your subject, you probably are like if it's a completely different culture, probably going to have to immerse yourself in that. You're going to have to go much further in depth with the work than simply just typing into Google, "Hey, what's this?" or looking on maps and seeing how the city landscape looks and all that stuff. Right? You have to actually see basically go through a day living there and actually, really take in all the conversations, everything you overhear, everything you observe, and then put that on the page somehow.
And you actually might and again, you might even know better than me, because I know you've taken travel research trips before. I know, the novel you're working on is set in northern New Hampshire, and correct
Yep.
me if I'm wrong, but I know you have been up there to, like, just check things out and see what things were like up there. Like, what was that experience like?
Yeah, that was basically just a good excuse to party. Like
Okay.
it was basically a
Okay,
good excuse,
that's fine, that's
honestly. And I
fine,
say
that's
that
fine.
like it was
um,
research, right? But this is kind of where you get back to like like using it, as time away, right? But like it's basically like something where I went up there for basically like usually I go up there anyways a couple times a year, but these trips basically were like at least a week in length, where I was actually going and looking at some of the buildings. I would go through some of the old mills they had up there. I would look at what the bar scene was like. I would go look at seeing what the day to day is like, and with that, mix that in with all the fun stuff like fishing and like going ATVing and all that stuff. Sort of sprinkled sprinkled in with it, right? The real purpose. But yeah, it takes that. Like that helped out a lot. I was able to come back after like a week up there. You can come back and you can more or less write the whole story, like because the center of what you write about is nothing to do with where you are at, right? You can tell every type of trope in almost any type of environment, right? The environment is just the scenery that you have to sprinkle in to make it feel real. And so once you spend, at least a little bit of time there, you should have enough that you can fill the gaps in the page between the characterization to sort of fill that out. But yeah, it took that. It's required it for me to be able to kind of know the subject a lot better. Yeah.
I really like your way of putting that. I think, again, that's just a really smart way of going about it. Again, having read your novel, your novel does take place in mills and certainly in bars. And so if you can make that feel real and not cliched or hackneyed, I think that's really important. Again, you were joking about the partying and, fishing part of it, but honestly, like if you're taking a whole trip somewhere for a week, which is a pretty long time, like you're probably not going to need all that time to just do research and check things out, and two, you're probably going to get burned out if you're just like going to different places every day and
Yeah.
like writing tweets about them or something like that. And so I think it makes sense to, work in some recreation or fun if you're taking a trip like that, just for your own sanity. But then too, I think that those recreational activities that you're doing in the place, for example, fishing, could either make it into that project or maybe some future project. It's still an experience of being somewhere new that you could potentially work in somewhere. And maybe this raises a bigger issue of being a good writer is about having good experiences that you can then write about.
Yep.
And the idea that you can't just be writing in a room all day. You have to be living and experiencing things as well, continually growing as a person. So maybe this is too big of a scope for just this research segment that we're doing. But
I agree with you, and it probably is, but it's very fluid. Like the idea, what we're talking about really is just experience. Research is just more just a segmented part of that, right? It's us compartmentalizing it, but really it's about experience. That's why people who write for longer do better, right? That's why writers don't really peak and hit their magnum opus until like their 50s or their 60s or whatever, because it takes decades and decades of not just craft but of learning and living these other experiences to find the heart of the story and your subject well enough that you can actually talk about it in a strong way. But yeah.
this is one, I'm really glad that you pointed that out. Two, I think we're maybe like getting getting too big in scope. But we're probably winding down, but I want to loop
Yeah.
back to kind of the Googling research that we were talking about before.
Hmm.
Because one thing I definitely want to mention is that the Googling and looking up facts, or certainly anything on Wikipedia, can be a huge rabbit hole distraction time suck. That, if you say, okay, I'm going to sit down and write for an hour, and then after 10 minutes you go on Google to check a fact, you could very well end up reading something for, the remaining 50 minutes
Yep.
and not getting your writing time in at all. I used to be really, really bad about this when I was younger, and eventually I just stopped doing it. So what I'll do now is I'll do kind of research time as separate from writing time.
Hmm.
So if I'm, working on a manuscript and I get to a point where I need to know, okay, what date did this happen? Of course I could go look it up, but then that would be distraction. So I don't want to. So I'll just like in kind of square brackets, because those stand apart really easily. I'll write, check date later or something like that, or look this up later or something like that. And I'll do this for anything that requires kind of that quick Google.
Yep.
Or the more in-depth research that I did before. And then what I'll do is that later in revision, or when I'm typing up edits or whatever, I'll go back and kind of look for all those brackets and kind of look them up all at once, or look them up as I'm quickly typing up changes or something like that, where I'm kind of less likely to get distracted. So in that way, I'm able to retain the core writing time for just writing instead of things like Googling.
Yeah. And I guess, like, to wrap this up, obviously we talked about Google, we talked about Reddit, living experiences, all that stuff. But I think the final thing to be aware of with this is the idea that this does basically fall on you, the writer, to know this. Like, there's no editor that's going to save it. It's going to go through and fact check all this for you later on. Like, you can't just write the whole thing and worry about it, later. This is something you have to know as the writer. You have to know. So
Yes.
just to impress that upon you, in case anyone thought, someone else can do the research for me later on.
No, and actually, we should have started with that, actually,
Yeah.
because I would argue that mindset is a fundamental aspect of being a good writer. You can't you can't think that those details are beneath you or anything like that, because if you have an attitude like that, whether it's about, what's the capital of Michigan, or, what date was Christopher Columbus born, it doesn't matter. If you see those details as being beneath you, then you're going to be a worse writer because of it.
Absolutely.
And other people, I think, are going to resent you for one, not knowing that, or not taking the time to figure that out when it's very easy. But then two, potentially making other people do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I see it again. I see it all the time. There was someone I was coaching basically a couple weeks ago. They wrote a graveyard story, and they're a young kid, but like they basically referenced the fact that there'd been bodies in the graveyard that were like, that had like Templar like uniforms, like hundreds of over 1,000 years old basically, right? And I was like, when the U.S. was founded, right, when this graveyard would have been constructed, would have been hundreds of years later, and they didn't occur to them, right? And even when I pointed out, they go, no big deal. And I'm like, okay, you have to understand, like, this is like a thing here, like you have to be factually accurate. But so that's why I bring it up. It sounds obvious to us, but like it happens more than you might think. Yeah. And so I guess with that, we've said our piece, so we'll wrap this up. We'll be back next week. As always, if you enjoyed it, please give a like. And with that, we will see you next time. I'm Josh Bresslin, and that's Ian M. Rogers.
Take it easy.